need not rush with your lunch. We'll give you time. That we are ready to commence meeting number 56 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Before I continue, I just want to advise committee members that this is the last meeting that our clerk, who's been with us for a while, Danielle, will be with us. And I want to introduce the new clerk, David Chandonnet. Chandonnet. Oui? Oui. And David reminded me he was on another committee I was on a number of years ago. Let's go. So welcome, David. And Danielle, thank you so much for guiding a rookie chair through a process. A rookie chair, and sometimes it was a little rocky, I'll admit. But I find pardon, Madame Chabot? Okay, I can see this meeting is going like that. Anyhow, welcome, David and Danielle. Thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll see you again. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House of Commons Order of June 23rd, 2022, which means there will be members appearing virtually and in the room. For those members appearing virtually and in the room, please get my attention and wait until I recognize you before you speak or if there is an issue. Use the raised hand icon on the bottom of your surface, and those in the room, simply raise your hand to get my attention. This meeting, again, is you have the option of choosing the official language of your choice, and if there is an issue with interpretation, translation, please get my attention. We'll suspend while it is being corrected. As I indicated, please direct all comments through me, the chair. In accordance with the routine motions, witnesses and those appearing virtually have been tested. As my understanding, translation is good. If you are not using a House of Commons approved headset, I will not recognize you to participate verbally, although if you are a member of the committee, you could still vote by giving me an indication. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, November 21st, 2022, the committee will resume its study of the National Housing Strategy. And I would like to welcome our guest, Paul Mason, Senior Vice President, Client Solutions. That's an important one, Mr. Mason. Simon Lahu, Director, Financing Solutions. Benjamin Williams, Director, Indigenous and North Housing Solutions. I have waived the 5-minute opening statements because this is our second hour. Because this is our second two-hour meeting, and the president was in for the first meeting and gave a general overview. But Heavy, you may be able to capture something. I'm going to use my prerogative as chair, Mr. Mason, to. I have an opening question, more of a comment. You would see if you in the two meetings a high degree of frustration being exhibited by demonstrated by members on all sides of this committee, and it focuses on CMHC's ability to in a timely fashion get program funding out to primarily not-for-profit organizations and small municipalities. And what struck me, and why I'm asking this question, because when the president was in at an earlier meeting, in her opening comments, she had made a statement that was a surprise to me, is that CMHC has had to change over the past number of years. The CMHC, for a long period of time, was primarily focused on delivering lending, long-term lending. It was a lender, to use their terms. And now CMHC is now moved into the area of producing grants or processing grants to various organizations on a wide spectrum of housing programs. So if you could just briefly give the committee an opinion on, just an overview of how CMHC is structured today versus what was a number of years ago. And then we'll move into the questioning round. And you could follow up on any of your prepared or comments as you respond to questions from committee members. But it struck me because I assumed the CMHC was in the field of delivering these programs that is now for a long period of time. But it was my understanding when the president appeared is that was not the case.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having us here today. It's my pleasure to be here with two of my team members to answer your questions. So in reference to your question, Mr. Chair, it is true that when the National Housing Strategy was launched, CMHC had to ramp up what we refer to as our direct delivery capability, funding direct projects through an application-based process, which are the majority of the National Housing Strategy programs. That was not something that CMHC had been doing for a number of years. We had some legacy funding, and of course we have our commercial businesses, our mortgage insurance and our securitization commercial businesses. And so at the beginning of the NHS, we actually had to ramp up that capability, and definitely we had some growing pains with that. I fully acknowledge that as we started to implement these capabilities, the processes, and so forth, that we were in some degrees learning as we went. But through that process, we consistently sought feedback from our clients, from proponents, from all sectors of the housing sector, and continuously tried to improve that. And it's something that we continue to do today. We consistently seek feedback, whether it's through our clients, whether it's through venues such as this committee, to get feedback and deal with issues as they arise. We have seen steady improvement in our processing times, reduced them over 50% over the last several years, and we continually measure not just our client satisfaction, but how difficult it is to work with us, as well as something we call our Net Promoter Score, which is at its root, how likely is someone to recommend CMHC. So we constantly look at those measures as well as the qualitative feedback that we get from our clients and look to improve. I think as Romy Bauer said when she was here, there's obviously still room for us to continue to improve, but we're quite happy actually with the progress to this point in terms of the number of commitments that we've made and the funding that we have committed. We've basically committed practically all the funding that's been allocated to us so far in the strategy, and that crosses the spectrum, including not-for-profits.
Thank you, Mr. Mason. I'm sure that there will be a team follow throughout this meeting. We'll now go to questions. We'll open the floor to Mr. Aitchison for 6 minutes. Mr. Aitchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. First thing I'd like to do, actually, aside from thanking you for being here in person, which is very important, especially on a winter day, would you be able to table with the committee a list of every project funded either with grants or loans through the National Housing Strategy, broken down by the various different programs and by municipality generally? Is that a list you could give us?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. I'm wondering, and I'm glad that the chair started this out with a discussion of the frustrations that a lot of Canadians have had trying to deal with this program, and I read what you were going to say before the plan changed, and I'm pleased to read that you have simplified the processes, because I'm sure you can imagine there are a lot of examples, particularly of community organizations that have just given up. I can give you a couple of examples in my writing. Community Living South Muskoka had the land ready to go. It was zoned. Municipalities were all ready. Everything was ready to go. They went through a couple of years of that process, and then when it got to the CMHC, they gave up, and they sold the land. That was pretty tragic. The minister was actually just in Sault Ste. Marie announcing funding for a really cool project that I think we should be doing literally across this country, the redevelopment of a Legion. Legions are, facing their age as structures, and their organizations are changing, and these are great opportunities. Former Liberal member of Parliament, Dennis Mills, has got a project in Bala, Ontario, at the Legion property. Great, huge chunk of land. The municipality's got everything zoned and ready to go. He's not giving up because he's like a dog with a bone. He will not give up, but he has given up on the CMHC and this government for sure. He just doesn't get it. He doesn't understand why it's so difficult. And of course I recognize that you got to be careful with taxpayers' money. But when I started to look through just the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, I started to go through the checklists, and of course there's the integrity declaration. There's the purpose of the funding. If you're eligible, you got to go through that checklist, and then of course there's a lovely spreadsheet where you see if it's feasible or not. Then of course there's a minimum environmental and accessibility instructions that seem to go above and beyond building codes, and it made me realize why Covenant House. When I went to visit Covenant House in Vancouver, amazing story, a fabulous facility they've got there. They built this new structure, and I asked them, "Did you get any funding from CMHC?" And they said, "Yes, we got $12 million. Isn't that incredible? Now, it was an $80 million or $100 million project, but that's great. They got $12 million. It cost them $1 million in consulting fees to work through the quagmire that is the process known as the CMHC. So, Community Living South Muskoka didn't have that kind of money to work through the quagmire, so they gave up and sold the land. I want to know if you can tell us what you've done to simplify the process, so that organizations that don't have Ryan Reynolds, sponsoring them and raising the awareness about the importance of the organization and the resources to spend that kind of money on consulting fees and lobbyists. What have you done to make it easier for those community organizations that literally are on the front lines of this issue and want to make the change that every community in our country needs? What have you done to make it easier?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So over the last year, in response to the question, we implemented a new process in the co-investment fund, which was a contribution-only stream, where we turned around applications in as little as 4 weeks. Those were targeted specifically at the smaller not-for-profits to make it simpler. There was not a loan component associated with those, and we were granting up to $125,000 a door for those particular ones. So that was in recognition of the lessons learned around dealing with those organizations, and as well dealing with the level of affordability. So that's just one example. I would say that another example is that we've worked very closely to reduce the amount of paperwork and legal requirements that are to sign the final agreement, and to improve it as a process. So those are just two examples that we've looked at. The third thing I would say is that we took the lessons learned from some programs and applied it to the rapid housing. And that's an example of where we've taken our processes and really reduced them dramatically to enable for ease of application.
So can I quickly jump in there and ask then, based on what you said about some of these projects being turned around in 4 weeks, that almost sounds too good to be true. I'll take you at your word. I believe you. In your list that you provide this committee of all the projects, can you identify the timelines on each of those projects as well? Application point to delivery point?
I think we should be able to, because we do
or
measure,
at least, at the very least, give me a list of the projects that you're able to turn around in 4 or 5 weeks.
we do. Sorry. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yeah. We do measure our turnaround times across all of our application processes, so we should provide at least the overview of the turnaround times.
Okay, no, that would be fantastic. I think I'm almost out of time here, but and so I'll leave it at that, because I want to come back to the headline number of $82 billion or $89 billion. We're never exactly sure where we are, but I want to talk to you more about that as well, but I think I'll have another round. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aitchison. Mr. Collins, for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and welcome, guests. My first question is around the Federal Housing Advocate's recent recommendation, where she talked about we're at the 5-year point with the National Housing Strategy. And her recommendation is that the government look at the strategy and possibly make some changes. And so I guess my first question would be, through you, Mr. Chair, do you agree with the recommendation? A lot obviously has changed since it was first released. We've gone through the pandemic. We've witnessed a wholesale change in terms of what's happening in the affordable housing sector as it relates to need. There's more need today than ever before. And so I guess my question would be, do you agree with that recommendation, and what changes might you recommend, or are you going through an official process at CMHC based on her recommendation?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So through the National Housing Strategy, we actually do an evaluation of our programs every 3 years. It's part of the National Housing Strategy, in addition to other feedback, such as the feedback that you referenced. And in addition to that, we're constantly adding new programs to the National Housing Strategy. So it has not been a static strategy. So we've added the Rapid Housing Initiative as an example of that, as we've looked to speed up the delivery of deeper affordability, which the Rapid Housing program does deliver. So it's something that we're constantly looking at and assessing both the performance of the existing programs in terms of their intent, and I think in general whether or not the impact we're having is what it was intended.
If I could, Mr. Chair, speaking of deep affordability, and I think it speaks to some of the issues that Scott raised earlier in terms of the grants and the application process. So Rapid Housing, I think, is probably the most successful program that you've offered of all the National Housing Strategy programs to date. As a former councillor and someone who worked with City Housing Hamilton, for us it was amazing because there was deep affordability. The grant ratio, at least in our municipality, was about 75-25 or 80% 20 almost, if memory serves me right. You were providing $300,000 for a unit when modular units were costing about $350,000 through rounds 1 and 2. And now what I've witnessed in round 3 is that the grant number has been reduced for most municipalities, at least in Southern Ontario, and that's my only context in this regard. I'm not certain what you provided across the country. So in Southern Ontario, the grants, on average, it looks like have gone down to about $265,000 a door, which is far less than the $300,000 that you provided through the first 2 rounds. And the cost of a modular unit now is about $550,000, almost $600,000. Tenders haven't come in yet, but it looks like the industry fee for modular units is in that range. And so the dilemma that municipalities have, at least for those that are participating and have been granted the opportunity to apply, is that the grant portion has gone substantially down. We're now down to about 55% per door, and the cost of the units they've almost doubled. And so can you rationalize what decision-making process that you made to determine that the grant numbers should be reduced in round 3 when costs and expenses related to modular, and most are purchasing modular? How did you arrive at that decision?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So as we design the program, we always look at what is the depth of affordability that we're trying to achieve. In the case of Rapid Housing, we're trying to achieve as close as what we would call to core housing need, which is 30% of income as an affordable unit, no more than 30% of income. For that affordable unit is the deepest one that we offer. At the same time, we're trying to also create as many units as possible. So as we work with each of the municipalities, as well as through the projects that come in, we look to assess those projects that are most likely to achieve those outcomes, and to try and ensure that the money that we spent goes as far as we can. I do acknowledge that over the last 5 years, going back to your first question around the overall NHS, we've seen a significant increase in the cost of construction across the board, as well as the cost of borrowing money due to inflation. And so it does put some strain on the number of units that can be delivered with the funding that is available.
And so can I ask how you arrived at $265 a door? Is it, you were 300 before, you obviously had an internal meeting with staff and your board about what kind of support you would provide. So we see expenditures rising for everyone who's trying to get into the RHI 3 round, and you've decided to, for whatever reason, to provide less support. So can I just understand the rationale? I certainly understand the context in terms of how the program is created and what your intent is, but there are challenges for municipalities right now because they can't afford almost to participate in the program when you're almost asking them to pay half the cost.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. When we design these programs, we work within our authorities in terms of what we're able to do. So we do work internally, but also with the government in terms of determining what the right level and authorities are within the program.
Okay. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? Okay. I'll save my question then for the next time. Thank you.
Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for these very important discussion on our national housing strategy. If we remember what the objective is to offer affordable housing, which are less and less available. The need is there, a strong demand for these. And for a lot of individuals, it's an impossible task. So the definition of affordability, if you will, our national strategy has one definition, that less than 30% of the revenue is set aside for housing. This is a general definition, but there are different and various affordability definitions depending on the program. The co-investment fund that we have, that would do either renovate rather or build. The definition of affordability there is rental fees at 40% or less of market and revenue. The PBO has indicated that this causes some confusion because if you have to spend more than 30% of your household income on lodging, it's fairly heavy. All programs don't use the same definition of affordability from the outset. Why? Thank you, Chair, for the question.
See, we do believe there's one single definition of affordability, and that is that an individual spends less than 30% of their pre-tax income on lodging. The NHS programs have different criteria associated with them depending on the groups targeted and the policy intent of the program itself, as well as the level of grant contributions, which directly affects the level of affordability that could be achieved. So I would say that we do have one single definition of affordability, but there are different criteria depending on the different program.
Well, it sort of creates a bit of problem depending on which program you're applying through. But will it have any effect on the capacity of HCMC to get the targets, meet the targets, and get to the objective? Affordability in Montreal, for example, anything over 2,000 a month is affordable. And if there's only one definition of affordability overall in our national housing strategy, why would you have variable criteria to have affordable unit? You said 30% of gross family revenue. So once again, thanks you, Chair, for the question.
Again, we have one single definition of affordability. However, we do have different criteria depending on the program. What I would offer is that we have actually pretty significantly exceeded those affordability requirements across the majority of our programs, including the National Housing Co-Investment Fund and the Rental Construction Finance Initiative. For example, under the National Co-Investment Fund, we are achieving rents for the affordability in the range of $650 a month. And it does vary across the country, but that's much lower than the minimum criteria that are established in the program. So as applications come in, we prioritize those that achieve the greatest outcomes, and particularly affordability, but others as well. So we work very hard within those programs to exceed the criteria that were set.
On est à mi-chemin, Monsieur le Président.
Well, I believe that we're midway through the strategy. It's been 5 years so far. And now that you're at midpoint, do you think that it's important to try to adjust or align, or, as you said, ensure that there might be one major criteria for affordability, and we should all try to use that one definition? Are you going to review the definitions of affordability? Because we've received 2 reports so far from the PBO indicating that this causes some confusion or concern. Even if there's one definition, the criteria are different from program to program. So it's quite difficult to figure out how many units have been created on an affordability basis if affordability is variable depending on program. And is that part of your process to arrive at a single definition of affordability?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So as I indicated earlier, we do have an evaluation of our programs that happens every 3 years. Right now, we are delivering those programs and the definitions as they are within our authorities. As I said earlier, we are achieving much greater, much lower rents. For example, in Montreal, the average affordable rent right now coming out of the co-investment fund is $513 a month. For us to achieve deeper levels of affordability, it's not simply about changing the criteria. It's also the structure of the program and the amount of grants contribution available to achieve those deeper levels of affordability. So again, CMHC does conduct an evaluation of our programs every 3 years, and then recommendations flow out of that.
Ms. Kwan for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the officials for being here today. Just building on the affordability question, could officials table to the committee a breakdown of all the units that has been funded by CMHC, broken down by a stream, and then broken down by province, municipality, and the rent that for each of the projects to which they've been allocated, because there are issues of affordability. They vary from program to program, and while the 30% rent of total income is the, I guess, stated affordability for CMHC, its application is simply not there. And we see it on the ground, very much so. And formally, asked of the question about affordability, I'm sorry to say CMHC's response is, we don't actually look at affordability. So if you do look at affordability, I would like to actually see the rent all the way from its inception for all of the units that has received CMHC program support. The other thing that I want to raise is on the co-investment fund. 87% of the units receiving funding or under construction are in Ontario, despite Ontario representing only 39% of the population. Other provinces, Alberta, BC, Quebec, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, are grossly underrepresented. Why is there such a disparity?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. The National Housing Co-Investment Fund is an application-based process, so we don't have specific carve-outs or allocations based on region. We do look at the applications coming in and look to prioritize both where the greatest need as well as the greatest outcomes of the applications that come in. What I would say is that across all of our programs, we are to some degree oversubscribed in the amount of applicants that we have. In other words, we have more applicants coming in than we have funding at this point to commit. And we have been committing our full budgets as they are allocated to us.
No doubt. So it's interesting. Is first come, first serve, it sounds like then. So there are 4,499 units pending in BC. They have yet to receive funding. So so could you advise and table to the committee, what dates did these projects apply for the co-investment fund? In fact, if we could get that information for all of the co-investment fund application per Mr. Atkinson's request, that would be helpful. So now for these projects that are pending, where funding has not rolled out, will the $25,000 per unit limitation apply to these pending projects?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. We disperse our funding as the construction progresses in our programs. Any project that was committed prior to any cap on the funding should not have that cap applied. And so those should proceed as planned if they were already committed by CMHC. And then once an agreement is signed, we actually disperse the funding in alignment with the construction schedule, which unfortunately can sometimes take time due to construction delays.
Thank you. So it'd be useful to actually also, in the data that you will provide, to advise when was the approval provided for these projects, and when did money actually flow, and the amount of dollars that have broken down on a on a unit basis as opposed to the overall amount. When did the cap come in, the $25,000 cap?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So last year, in the fourth quarter, we put the cap into place. We put it into place in order to preserve the amount of contributions that we have and make it go as far as we can in terms of helping as many people as we possibly can. We did this at the same time that we had a contribution-only stream as well, which was not subject to that cap and could go up to $125,000 a door for those particular projects.
So maybe we can get the information on with the application. So are you saying now that people can actually apply for the $125,000 contribution stream? Because I got 3 letters, by the way, from the minister, signed pretty well all on the same day, saying, one, that the co-investment fund has been depleted, go somewhere else. Another telling another MP, go apply for money under the co-investment fund. And then in a response to my letter, the minister says the money will only go to really essentially projects that are shovel-ready. So there's different applications depending on who asks the questions, I guess. But it would be really good to actually get the honest truth of what the state of the co-investment fund is. So can you advise the committee how much money is left in the co-investment fund?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. There is approximately $150 million, make sure I get that number correct, of contribution room left in the co-investment fund. That's for new construction. There's about $900 million in contribution room left for the repair stream of the National Co-Investment Fund. And for each of the streams, we have a little over $2 billion of loans left to be funded. To be allocated.
So there are 115,000 units that have received commitment from CMHC, but have not received the money. So for those 115,000 units, can you confirm that none of them would have the $25,000 cap applied to them?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I can confirm that any project that was committed to in advance of the cap would not be subjected to the cap.
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. Has concluded. Ms. Ferrari, you have 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Let's see what I can do in 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
I'm sure you'll accomplish a lot.
Thank you guys so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And I'm wondering if I could start really quickly talking about my own riding of Peterborough, Kawartha. Major housing issue in my riding, homelessness obviously on the rise significantly. But there were 2 applications that came in from our city in the last couple of years, and they were denied. But they don't know why. So can you tell me what the process is as quickly as possible, because I have so many questions. What do you do for follow-up? How can people figure out what they've done wrong and follow up with that application that was denied?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We do have client service people across the country. We should be explaining why an application was denied. So I'm happy to look into these specific circumstances, but we do have client service folks who not only should be communicating this, but also should be working with our clients in terms of the application process.
Thank you so much. I would love if you could follow up with that. Is it the responsibility of the city to follow up, or your client services will do that?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We should be proactively following up when an application is not approved and explaining why it isn't. In most cases, we actually go back and try to work with the client or the proponent to let them know what wasn't working and try to work with them to see if it can work.
Okay. If I may, we've heard a lot of obstacles, a lot of negatives around CMHC, and I know you're trying to provide the best service possible. I guess where I'm asking in terms of even coming back to that, like service standards and rolling out the programming and helping those in need as we do have a housing crisis, do you feel that you've been supported by the minister? Do you feel you were given clear direction and clear communication on how the program should operate? Do you feel that you were sort of left to do it on your own, or do you feel that there's been very good direction and management from the Minister of Housing?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I feel that our authorities and the direction of these programs and the definition of them is very clear. As we operationalize them, there is some flexibility that CMHC has in terms of how we implement the programs. And so the processes and so forth are put into place by us. But in keeping with our authorities and the intent of the program, both in terms of delivering, but also being good stewards of the government's money as well.
So you're happy with how the minister is running the housing program? Yes, just yes or no?
Thank you for the question. Yes.
Okay, thank you. The Parliamentary Budget Officer released an updated assessment yesterday on the National Housing Strategy, or NHS, as a lot of people know it. And I just want to, if I can, sort of talk about this. Last night I had a very emotional conversation with a man, and his kids are, adults, are living at home. He's really scared. Like, this is a conversation I have a lot with parents, right? They're really worried their children are never going to be able to afford homes. Like, it's a genuine fear. What are we going to do for our children? And, I see a lot of things that have come out of this that, it's $7 billion more than the CMHC had forecasted. There's no standard definition of affordability, which is a major issue, as we know. But the thing that really jumped off the page from this assessment is that while federal investments in addressing affordable housing and homelessness have increased, so too has the cost of residential construction, reducing the real purchasing power of federal spending. And I think what I'm trying to tie here, if I may, is we've been really adamant about the carbon tax and inflation. And I feel like this just shows this vicious cycle. You're $7 billion more than intended. If you continue to spend more, and then things keep going up, you're never going to meet that demand. It's like we're caught in this vicious cycle. If the purchasing power doesn't have the power it needs, and we have inflation constantly going up, but you're spending more and you're not getting more, how do you stop that, and how do you reconcile being able to meet the demand and have that purchasing power? Do you think carbon tax is an issue in all of this?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would have to defer personally on the carbon tax. It's not my area of expertise, but what I will say is that the increase in cost of construction is definitely having an impact. We, CMHC, have reported ourselves and analyzed that we need to build about 3.5 million more homes over and above what we were planning to build between now and 2030. So there is definitely a supply-driven affordability issue in the country. This is not an issue that can be solved alone by either CMHC or the federal government. We say it's a bit of a team sport, that we have our role to play, and I think if the programs were not operating, then things would likely be worse. But it takes partnering with municipalities, with provinces, and with the private sector in order to really drive up the supply in this country.
Mr. Long for 5 minutes. Mr. Long.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to my colleagues, and thank you to our CMHC witnesses. Thank you for what you do for Canadians. Just real quick on the carbon tax, I was thrilled to see Conservative Premier Blaine Higgs openly accept the federal backstop yesterday and openly acknowledge that that's the way that people in New Brunswick will get support to help them fight inflation and other costs. So I was happy to see that. But back to CMHC. Mr. Mason, I thank you for being forthright. I thank you for your answers so far. And I just want to kind of talk with you about how you did ramp up. And certainly we recognize that, you know, before 2017, there was really little investment in housing. And we also recognize that really housing is provincial jurisdiction. But, you know, we recognize as the federal government, we do need to step in. We have a role to play. We need to help. And obviously we did, you know, roll out the $82 billion housing strategy. You know, CEO or President Bowers, she reminded us that, you know, again, before 2017, CMHC really wasn't into dealing with proponents, nonprofits, and residential housing. So can you just talk to us very briefly about
the sound quality coming from the current speaker is not sufficient for interpretation to be provided. Interpretation will resume as soon as the sound quality allows it.
Okay.
Would you raise the boom and try it again?
Sure. Is that any better?
Speak for a few moments.
Sure. Testing 1, 2, 3. My questions were for CMHC. Testing 1, 2, 3.
I think she said no. No. So we'll just suspend for a moment.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And thank you for the team that we have before us this morning. As was said earlier, when the Chair first spoke, you can understand the very frustration that's felt here at this committee. But it's a frustration with the global situation, not you specifically. The challenges are significant, and it's not an easy task. I'd like to hear you on what do you think you could do more to speed up the process? Get the shovels in the ground, and how we might improve, perhaps, process. What can we do to assist you in accelerating the process and to fulfill the national housing strategy?
Merci pour la question.
Thanks for the question, Chair.
It's a great question. We, as I said earlier, we constantly are trying to improve our processes and speed up our processing. But what we've seen on the ground is there's been a lot of delays on the construction side. So right now, about 20% of the projects that are funded have completed construction up until this point, and that's a part of the process that is out of our control in terms of how quickly those can build. And when we look at projects and applications that come in, As I said, we try to prioritize those that have the most in terms of their outcomes, but also those that look like they're viable and can be completed relatively quickly. So those things help us move the whole process end to end along. I would say that, outside of the National Housing Strategy, it can take anywhere from 8 to 10 years to get, especially multi-unit housing developed. The government is considering a housing accelerator fund right now, and that's the intent of that is to look to remove any barriers that may exist at the municipal level in terms of development. So that's another area that I think can be helpful.
Merci.
Yes, thank you. Well, the Auditor General has also tabled a report, and he addressed a certain part of the National Housing Strategy. Can you speak to us of the other programs that were not object of the OAG's report? And a further question, I know that you've implemented a dedicated client service to nonprofits. I'd like to know how progress is proceeding there as well, if you may.
Merci encore pour la question.
Once again, thanks for that question, Chair.
We've, as I said earlier, taken feedback seriously from our clients and looked at not just how we improve our processes, but the types of resources we have on the ground working with proponents and with clients to help them complete the application process. As we talked about earlier, if an application comes in that isn't quite ready or isn't quite at the point where the project is viable, we have staff across the country who work with proponents to try and help make those projects viable. We definitely want any project that we fund to have a high likelihood of success. We talk a lot about numbers, but at the end of the day, this is affecting real people, and we want these projects to be successful on the ground. So when we look at the work that we do, we take that feedback, we build those relationships with those groups, and work hard to deliver.
Thank you, Madame Martinez-Ferreira. Madame Chabot, pour 2 minutes et demi.
2.5 minutes, Madame Chabot. Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, I find this discussion very interesting. I think we could use another 10 hours, I think, but it seems to be taking the construction problems on the ground. Okay. But we have to find ways of speeding up the actual construction of affordable units. So that's my main concern, my main preoccupation. I know that you do a review every 3 years, etc., but we're at midpoint in our national strategy. If we take a look, take a step back and look over the horizon. What's going well? What's not going well? What could be improved in order to improve it? I'll take an example. There's going to be potentially a third wave, the rapid building program. It's received some pretty good press from various and sundry. Then it does respond to the requirements. In BC, for example, what they've done there, I don't know if we have a full report, but they put into place an organization which allows nonprofit organizations to purchase a unit, all the while respecting the affordability criteria. A lot of the programs are more heavy from an administrative point, and at midpoint now, more money's been added to the program. And what recommendations would you make, concrete recommendations, so that we at least, through the numbers that you're going to give us, we see that there is a real difference being made for those in need?
Merci pour la question, Monsieur.
Thanks again for the question, Chair.
So, when we look at the success of the National Housing Strategy so far, we've actually committed getting very close in terms of both repairs and new units to the initial targets laid out in the National Housing Strategy. The rapid housing program, which is in its third round, is delivering deep affordability as quickly as possible. So we have streamlined both the application and the approval process, as well as looking for proponents to commit to timelines. We have had lessons learned through that program, so we've allowed those timelines to increase a little bit, realizing the challenges on the ground with construction and so forth. But it's still very rapid in comparison to normal housing development. So again, the rapid housing, I think, is a good example of taking lessons learned from the first few years of the programs and applying them to this new program.
Another round.
Jacques Coxtel?
Time has lapsed.
Merci, Madame Shabbat. Miss Kwan, for 2.5 minutes, please.
So with the 115,000 units that are still waiting for the funds to flow from the co-investment fund, is the remaining funds then in the co-investment stream spoken for?
So I think I would like to pass this question on to my colleague, Mr. Lahoud.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Any projects that have funding committed to them, the funds are there for them. With regards to the spending, we actually advance funding as the projects build.
Sorry, I'm going to cut this short because I'm 2.5 minutes. My question is the remaining funds with the co-investment fund spoken for?
Thank you for the question. The numbers that my colleague here cited earlier are not spoken for. So there is roughly $2.5 billion of low-cost loans that are still available, as well as about $150 million of contributions that are not yet spoken for.
Thank you. So the information that one of the projects that's actually pretty well shovel-ready, and we're told that it's been depleted, is wrong information. All right, good to know. The PBO just issued a report yesterday to say that the government is not accounting for inflation with its programs. So the CMHC anticipate that projects will not become viable with the 25,000 per unit cap.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So we are still receiving applications with the $25,000 cap that are viable. So we are still processing applications even with that cap. Again, the intent of the cap is intended to...
Thank you. How many of the projects have withdrawn, or has any proponents or applicants withdrawn their application with the $25,000 cap?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We'll get back to you with that information.
If we could get a breakdown with that information, if they have withdrawn, where it is in the units that are being proposed, that would be helpful. I'd like to actually turn to the Federal Lands Initiative. In 2021-2022, $50 million was committed to that initiative, but only $5.5 million has been dispersed. So that's 11%. On the government's website, which I just checked yesterday, it says there are no lands available. This is specifically dedicated for Indigenous community projects. So why is there such a slow rollout of this? And why does the website say that there's no land available?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So two parts to that question. The Federal Lands Initiative is a $200 million program over 10 years, and we've committed approximately half of that money to date. We work with other federal departments and Canada Lands to look for viable federal lands that can be made available for this program. And as they become available, we post them on our website, and then housing providers can apply for those particular projects. So as lands are made available, we do post them, and then they're offered for competition.
Can we?
Your time is gone.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, can I just ask if we can get the list?
Could you provide the list, Mr. Mason? Could you provide the list to the committee?
Excuse me, clarification, Mr. Chair, the list of...
Ms. Kwan, list of what?
Federal Land Initiative projects, where they are.
Yes, we can provide that.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kwan. Mr. Mason. Madame Falk, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Document titled Annex C that was provided to our committee following CMHC's appearance on December 5th indicates that a total of 627 applications were started for various program streams but not completed. Does CMHC track why these applications were not completed?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As applications come in, we do assess and seek feedback from our clients, especially when those do drop off. So when we talk about surveying our clients, we also survey those who are unsuccessful in our applications.
So how many of those applications were not completed because the process was overly cumbersome?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I don't have that exact breakdown. What I can tell you is that projects and applications are abandoned for a whole host of reasons. It could be changing circumstances on behalf of the proponent. It could be difficulty.
Are you able to table that information with this committee?
We can certainly table the list of applications that were withdrawn. We don't always know the reason why they're withdrawn. We will endeavor to provide as much as we can in that information.
And not knowing the reason, is that because those applying don't reveal that, or CMHC doesn't ask them?
It could be It could be that. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It could be that that the proponent does not let us know the specifics of the application, why it's been withdrawn.
Okay, so has CMHC identified parts of the application process that can be streamlined or simplified?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, there are a number of areas in the application process that we have streamlined, and we've done this consistently over the last several years to remove elements that are either cumbersome or too complicated for proponents. So we've done that a number of times over the last several years, and we constantly look at our processes and ensure that they're robust, but that they're not unnecessary steps.
So the National Housing Co-Investment Fund has the highest number of applications that were withdrawn. What reason is there for a higher number of withdrawn applications for this specific program?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask my colleague, Mr. Lahoud, to answer this question.
Thank you for the question. The majority of files that are withdrawn, either by the proponents or by us, are generally withdrawn because of viability reasons. There is either a funding gap in the project, or the project is not viable based on the rents and the cost of construction.
So what is the delay in that? Because we have heard in questioning earlier in this meeting that even the delay that CMHC has had, affordability, the cost of living, these taxes that keep increasing on the goods and services that Canadians are needing and utilizing. Does a delay in CMHC at all affect that?
Generally speaking, when we evaluate a project, we provide a conditional commitment if it's a viable project within 100 days. Once a project receives a conditional commitment, we work with our clients to move them to a state where they are ready for funding. So
100 days is a long time, isn't it?
If we are looking at contribution-only files, those are done within 30 days. But for files where there is a loan component, we work with our clients very closely to try to get them that answer as quickly as possible, and currently we do that within 100 days.
In the remarks that were provided to us for this meeting, it was mentioned that CMHC regularly surveys clients for feedback, and that client satisfaction was at 82% last year. So does CMHC measure client satisfaction with every individual or organization that interacts with CMHC?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, we survey all of our clients, including those who were not successful. So this is not just a statistics of those who were successful in getting funding.
Sorry, but 82%, that is quite high. For the amount of problems that we have heard at this committee, and in specific this meeting and the previous meeting with CMHC, I have a really hard time believing that clients are 82% satisfied with the services that they're receiving with CMHC.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. What I can tell you is that we survey all of our clients, and we do it in an unbiased way. So we send out surveys and ask for feedback of all of our clients.
Thank you, Ms. Falk. We're now. I'm going to return to Mr. Long and see if his audio is able to be efficiently translated. Mr. Long, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. I put some tinfoil up on my roof, so hopefully things might be a little better. I don't want to certainly test the interpreters, so hopefully things are better. No. Mr. Mason, I'm back.
Mr. Long, unfortunately, the tinfoil is not working this morning. The translation is advising me they cannot translate your audio, so I will now go to Mr. Collins for 5 minutes. Mr. Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like to follow up on the federal lands initiative, and so I in the early days of after my election, I asked about the process, and it seems like a very complicated one in terms of having to go through different ministries to make the lands available in order to even get an application into CMHC to apply for the resources. And so can I ask you your professional advice as it relates to improving that program, because you're one part of what many would consider a long process. And so I'll leave it at that in terms of what you believe what changes we need to make internally to make lands available in order for them to become eligible for the federal lands initiative money.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think we're actually quite happy with the progress on the federal lands to this point. As I said, we've committed over half the money, and it looks like we're going to likely exceed our unit targets through that program. We in the program rely on other departments to make lands available. And so that is the element that we need in order to execute on our part of this. So anything that can make that easier would make more lands available. But as I said, it looks like we're going to fully commit the money that we have. So it's not that we're lacking lands to be made available to achieve our targets in that program.
Next question would be around the Accelerator Fund. Everyone's anxious to see, what that involves. Of course, this committee undertook a study on the Accelerator Fund. Lots of expert advice. I had the opportunity when Ms. Bowers was here to raise that with her in terms of some of the recommendations. One of the key recommendations that flowed through that report was an acquisition fund for municipalities. I think some of the witness testimony we heard during the committee study, there was some consternation around what the housing industry looks like right now. Most municipalities will start to receive less applications from a development perspective. And so I think the thought process was you're investing in technology to increase applications and supply, obviously. You may be supporting staff to assist municipalities in processing those applications. But if developers, by and large, across the country are scaling back their applications, hard to count net new units when the trend is going in the opposite direction. And so can I get your advice on that in terms of will you take that into consideration when you unveil the program at some point in time in terms of you're supplying resources to an area where you may not yield the results that you want, and I think it was 25,000 units a year for 4 years?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It would be a little premature for me to comment specifically on the requirements of the Housing Accelerator Fund, but what I can tell you is that the intent is to work with municipalities to speed up development and increase the supply of housing being delivered in those communities. And that may look different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending on the municipality. And some of the work that we would do there is to assess what would be the right level of development that we would expect in these different municipalities. So again, the program isn't fully defined or approved yet, so it's a bit difficult for me to comment on the specific requirements, but that is the ultimate intent, to remove barriers that may exist for development in municipalities.
Okay. Will you be giving serious consideration to an acquisition strategy as part of that the program development? And I ask that because I think it was the top recommendation from the study from all stakeholders. And of course, those stakeholders are the ones that you're going to serve in that program. They were municipalities, not-for-profits, and others associated with development files at municipalities.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We'd be happy to consider any program of that nature from an implementation perspective, if that was the case. British Columbia has recently introduced a program like that at the provincial level.
Next question I would have is related to real estate investment trusts, and so you might be aware that we're undertaking a financialization of housing initiative probably within a month's time. Real estate investment trusts have played an increasingly larger role in the rental housing market across the country. In some markets, they're more prevalent than others. Certainly large municipalities across the country, we see REITs all over the place. I happen to reside in a REIT here. It's a hotel that's been converted into rental, which I think is great. I honestly believe that there is room for REITs in the rental market. They can play a role in terms of assisting, just as the private sector does in many areas. However, there's definitely been an impact in terms of rent increases as a result of their presence in the market, and it's having a negative impact on tenants. And I won't go through those issues because I think you're very well aware of what they are. Can I ask what kind of support you've provided to REITs through the National Housing Strategy in terms of all the programs that you've offered? Have REITs received assistance from you in loans or grants?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. The REITs account, I believe, for about 10 to 15% of the total housing market in this country. I can tell you through the National Housing Co-Investment Fund that 98% of the money has gone to either not-for-profits or other levels of government.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Ms. Gray, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'm trying to better understand the governance structure of the CMHC. So is it a fair assessment that the government may come up with funding housing initiatives, as you've talked about today, and then it comes to the CMHC to administer and come up with the staffing resources, policies, and processes to deliver and operationalize that initiative? Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, that is fair. Sorry, I apologize if I missed the first part of that comment, but we work with the government to provide advice, and then we implement and administer the programs as given to us through the authorities of central agencies.
Thank you. And your board of directors would sign off on those internal policies and processes to implement those government initiatives. Would that be correct?
So we have a pretty significant governance process within CMHC. The board does not necessarily sign off on all the policies and procedures that happen at the program level, but they provide oversight to the overall corporation.
Okay, thank you. And like any board of directors, the CMHC board of directors would have knowledge and information of the operation of those program initiatives at the board level before they're rolled out.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We do report on the progress and the achievement of those initiatives to our board, yes.
Great, thank you. So it appears that that your board of directors, like all of your employees, have to follow a code of conduct, which the CMHC calls the conflict of interest and post-employment policy. Would that be correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. The only reason I hesitate on answering the question is it's not really my expertise in terms of the terms of reference and the policies of our board. Mm-hmm. But I believe that is the case.
Okay, thank you. And does CMHC have any additional policies in place for board members regarding real or perceived conflict of interest in addition to the conflict of interest and post-employment policy of CMHC?
So we ensure that there is always separation between our board and any activities that we do on the ground. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Many of your board members also serve in leading roles with other housing or housing adjacent organizations or developments. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Our board members come from a variety of industries and organizations.
Okay. So yes or no, have board members recused themselves from any discussions on implementing or delivering government housing strategies which may have real or perceived conflict of interest based on the housing organization the board member may be involved in?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I am not part of necessarily of those proceedings within the board itself, so it'd be difficult for me to comment specifically on that.
Okay. Well, I do look forward to the CMHC tabling all the funding that has been given out by to all organizations as part of the National Housing Strategy, which was asked earlier in this meeting. So I do look forward to going through that. So, for example, one of your board members is the CEO of an organization that was allocated funding from CMHC for a housing project in Vancouver. Did this board member recuse herself from any decisions that may have led in any way to this funding?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We ensure that our staff on the ground are not working with our board members when it comes to any applications.
Okay. Did that same board member recuse herself from decisions regarding implementation or administration of the Rapid Housing Initiative, where money went to a project by that organization she's CEO of in Surrey, BC, a project that garnered media attention and was visited by many Liberal MPs, including the Liberal Deputy Leader, Chrystia Freeland?
Sorry, I apologize. I missed the question.
The question was whether or not the board member would have removed herself during any discussions on the Rapid Housing Initiative that would have been discussed at the board level.
That would be my understanding, yes.
Okay. So can you table for this committee the minutes from all CMHC board meetings from January 1st, 2016 to December 31st, 2022?
I suppose. So thank you for the question. Yes. I don't think the board minutes are confidential. Sorry, I apologize, Mr. Chair. This is a bit out of my area of expertise.
Mr. Mason,
Okay.
but you would consult with whatever
Consult with
authority you do
with our
and
team.
respond to the committee in a format that you are allowed to based on the legislation governing you. Thank you, Ms. Gray. Your time has excluded. Thank you, Mr. Mason. We'll now go to Madame Martinez-Ferrata for 5 minutes.
Oui, merci, monsieur.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to give you the opportunity to perhaps give us a summary of the program. With the urban and northern programs. An update on that, please.
Thank you. Merci pour la question, Monsieur le Président. Ça me donne l'opportunité de demander.
So it's my opportunity to ask my colleague, Mr. Williams, to answer this question.
Thank you very much for the question. Budget 2022 announced $300 million for the development and implementation of an urban rural northern housing indigenous strategy. CMHC will be delivering $18.5 million of that $300 million through indigenous organizations for the engagement and consultation process, and the launch of that was announced this week.
Thank you for that. I want to give you the opportunity also to give us an update on what you've learned about the rapid housing round 1 and 2, and how are you looking forward to putting the round 3 coming up, and just hear on your thoughts around the rapid housing.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think the two biggest learnings coming out of the first 2 rounds of rapid housing was giving a longer window to intake applications, so we've extended the window, and to increase slightly the time allowed for the completion of the housing projects. Obviously, what we want to approve projects that are ready to go, but we realized that with some challenges and construction delays, that the time requirements were a little too short. So those are probably the 2 biggest improvements we've made in the program.
Thank you. And what about agreements with provinces? How do you track those in terms of results and the bilateral agreements that we have with provinces?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So as part of the bilateral agreements, the provinces are required to report on the their progress through the bilateral agreements, and we have a team within CMHC that works with them and to standardize the reporting and ensure that the reporting is delivered in a timely fashion.
Okay. And last, I don't know how much time I have. Okay, good. So, and so you're going to table the by, you know, by writing or the projects that you have, and but I think the question around affordability, it's a really big one. And how can you give us, like, what are the numbers you can give us in terms of how many units have you created in terms of affordable units, and being clear on that, because I think there's a misunderstanding around in each programs, what are the results in terms of affordability. So if you could table those numbers, I think it would be useful for the members of committee to have those numbers. And again, in terms of affordability, the numbers around what do you mean by affordability? And how many nonprofit organizations are you supporting, accompany, and making sure that they can present projects in the different programs that you have, and maybe give us an update on those people that work at CMHC to work with these nonprofits, because, for instance, in Quebec, you have the technical resources, nonprofit organizations that works with nonprofits to do housing, but you don't have that in other provinces. So what is the role of CMHC, and how can you work with nonprofits to make sure that they actually tap in those projects?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So we are happy to table the number of units per program that we've committed and those that are considered affordable under the criteria of that program. But we can also provide, in particular for our two largest programs, Rental Construction Finance Initiative and the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, the average rents that we're achieving through those programs, and in relation to the minimum criteria, how much we're exceeding those. So we can do that. As it relates to our staff on the ground, our staff play a very important role working with the not-for-profits to help them both navigate the application process as well as to provide feedback on the applications and help work with them if a project comes into us that we don't feel is going to be viable, to work with them to determine what changes can possibly be made so this project can be viable and funded through our programs.
And maybe also share the numbers around objectives through clientele, because I know you're targeting, for instance, women, accessibility. So I know there's numbers there that you can maybe share with the members of committee too.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a very good point to note that it's not simply affordability. We do have requirements around climate compatibility, accessibility, and targets around the amount of funding that goes towards women and children, as an example. So we can provide those breakdowns. I can tell you right now that the percent of our total funding that's been allocated to serve the needs of women and children is around 30%.
Madame Martinez-Ferreira, Madame Chabot, pour 2 minutes et demie.
2.5 minutes. Yes. I'll try to get as much as I can out of it. Earlier this morning, you said you'd be able to give us some specific numbers as where we're at in various programs. Just an observation. We have received some complimentary information of tables, numbers, and 168 Quebec, 140, etc., etc. There's not much there. I can't make heads or tails of it, but perhaps it might be a little bit more specific and precise. But here's my question. The fight against homelessness, for example, is a super program. Most organizations, social vocation. It's unfortunate that a program such as this, to help the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, to get some kind of security from a housing point of view, and try to reduce by 50% homelessness or the unhoused. there's been a growth in the number of unhoused individuals and more and more mental health problems. The report is based on 2022. We can't really get a grasp on the full numbers, but does the program respond to the needs? You received a number of recommendations, I believe, from various reports, and were you able to implement any of the recommendations of the Auditor General? And if so, where can we find these changes? What type of concrete follow-up can you do for data collection and data supply?
Thank you very much for the question. Merci pour la question, Monsieur le Président. We did accept the findings of the Auditor General report, and we have already started to implement some of the key recommendations. And in fact, some of those recommendations were being implemented even prior to the completion of the report, including the reporting on who's actually living in the units that we're providing, as well as how Infrastructure Canada and CMHC work together. Infrastructure Canada is delivering the main program targeting chronic homelessness called Reaching Home, but it does fall under the umbrella of the overall CMHC, the overall National Housing Strategy.
Donc, concrètement, il y a eu des changements?
So you've made some concrete changes. You've accepted the recommendations, some of the recommendations. So we'll be able to know exactly how you're going to follow up on that program. Can you tell us how many individuals, vulnerable status, can we assist with these programs? Either people living with disabilities, single mothers, the homeless. Can you give us some numbers, the real impact that this is having? Or if it's still vague, if we can't measure the results, it leaves the impression, true or false, that the program isn't working. Thank you, Madame Chabot. Mr. Mason.
Respond in writing to Madame Chabot's question. I will now go to Ms. Kwan for 2.5 minutes.
On the REITs question, could the officials provide a breakdown of CMHC support for REITs and other corporate landlords for all of its initiatives within CMHC and broken down year by year and by jurisdiction?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, and I can confirm that REITs do not receive funding through our National Housing Strategy programs.
No, but they certainly receive insurance support and so on, and that's the nature of that. Although you did mention that in the co-investment fund, there's a small percentage of which went to REITs, which is shocking to me if that's the case. So I would like to get all of the information of how CMHC supports REITs and corporate landlords.
Thank you for the comment, Mr. Chair. I can confirm that REITs are not receiving funding through the co-investment program.
Okay, great. So if I could get all the information, though, with all the other programs CMHC provides to REITs from the inception, that would be helpful. On the issue around inflationary costs, so for committed projects under the co-investment fund where funds have not yet flowed, and with the cost of construction increasing and mortgage rates increasing, is there a place for those committed projects if people find themselves in a situation where they cannot meet costs because of the inflationary costs? Is there another pocket that they can turn to?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So we work with our clients after we've committed in any of our programs. We work closely with our clients to ensure that the project is viable, including if there's impacts of cost escalations. And again, we continue to work with them to see if we can make the project viable. Sometimes that does mean an adjustment in the contribution level. But again, we're managing within the envelope of funding that we have within those programs.
Can you table for the committee how many projects has become not viable and will not proceed as a result of inflationary costs and the timeline to which they've been stuck in the processing period with CMHC. Just a yes or no, and then I want to get some information on RCFI, if we can get an update on what's happening with the RCFI initiative.
I will take that question back. I think it might be difficult to determine categorically which ones for that, but we will endeavor to provide that information.
Ms. Kwan?
Sorry, on the RCFI, where is it at?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the RCFI as well is exceeding its current unit targets at this point in time, as well as the depth of affordability that we're achieving through the RCFI. If I can recall that the RCFI is primarily a supply-driven initiative, but having said that, the minimum requirements for affordability are currently being exceeded through that program as well.
Under the new requirements?
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. We'll now go to Mr. Aitchison for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you. This has, I'm sure, been one of your more enjoyable mornings. But I appreciate the answers you've given us in a difficult file. I mean, I think we've all acknowledged that it's challenging times. I also think it's important to acknowledge what you've pointed out, that CMHC is not alone in this space, and that it is one of the players that requires, other agencies within the federal government, provinces, municipalities, the private sector. Housing is kind of an all-hands-on-deck situation. But, you've acknowledged the need for the CMHC to dramatically improve its processes, to speed things up, to streamline the process. That's great. It's an important thing. Obviously, you know that had to happen, and I appreciate that you're doing that. You've also acknowledged that inflation is kind of eating away at every dollar invested, therefore, ultimately producing fewer units than we had hoped. And CMHC has also pointed out that we need probably about 3.5 million more units than would, I guess, as of right, be built over the next little while, which I think a total of 5.8 million units over the next 10 years. I guess the need is clearly quite dramatic in terms of housing units, and of course we've also heard all the reports about the the very beginning of the housing spectrum, whether it's homeless shelters and beds, the number of people that are not necessarily underhoused like we're dealing with a lot here, but the people who are literally homeless is growing in this country. Tent cities are growing. The number of homeless people that have died in the city of Toronto has doubled over the last couple of years, and so I appreciate that it's not the CMHC's job solely to fix this, but one of the things that the AG said back in her report was that there was no real champion for all of this, and so I'm not about to suggest that that's your job, Mr. Mason, to be the champion. You are a cog in this wheel. There's no question about that. But this is an epic situation. We've described it as a crisis around this table. Housing providers describe it as a crisis. Would you agree that Canada is facing a housing crisis right now?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As we at CMHC have said in the past, we believe there's an affordability crisis within Canada, driven primarily by supply. We feel if there's a lot of different aspects to housing in this country, but the one common denominator and underlying driver is supply. If there's one single thing that we can do is to increase the density and supply of housing in this country. As you pointed out, our research suggests we need to build 3.5 million more, call them houses, homes, over the next before 2030. And so that's not simply be achieved through government funding. It's going to require the private sector. It's going to require other orders of government, but it's actually going to require us to work together. And I think the biggest gain that we can make is by working together to try and solve this problem collectively.
would you be, I mean, and again, you may not have them right off the top of your head here, but would you be willing to provide us with some suggestions for things that we could be doing, or provide comment on some of the ideas that some of us have come up with? For example, the Federal Lands Initiative, I think, was a pretty small piece of the National Housing Strategy when you look at the overall strategy. But I think there's potential there. I think that the federal government, not necessarily always buildings necessarily, because sometimes commercial buildings don't make sense to turn into residential buildings, but what about, vacant land? One of the things we did when I was the mayor of Huntsville, for example, was we gave land away to Habitat for Humanity, to private developers with agreements that they would have a certain number of units within the complex that were affordable based on the CMHC definition. What other things should we be doing at the national level to put the feet to the fire of municipalities that are delaying rezoning processes, that we can pull out all the stops at the federal level to say, okay, we got to give up more land, make more land available. What other things would you suggest? And you have about 20 seconds to answer that.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. One program we haven't talked about today at all is the Innovation Fund, which is one of those programs that's intended to drive out innovations in the housing sector, whether it's construction or financing or other. Mm-hmm. I think there's a great opportunity. We just launched another stream of that. So I think that's really important. When you talk about working with municipalities and provinces, we feel that's really important, and I would characterize it as working together and looking at ways that we can collectively not just incent differences in municipalities, but how our programs can work together, because there are provincial and municipal programs in housing as well. And so at CMHC, we're constantly looking for ways to work with municipalities and provinces and better align the programs that we have.
Okay. Thanks very much.
We're going to Mr. Collins, and then we're going to end with 3 minutes with each party, as the clerk has identified. Mr. Collins for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I have a question around the whole issue of supply. So I certainly understand most of your targets all reference supply, but I'm a little bit concerned that we're missing the word affordable supply. And so you have affordability targets in many of the programs. We know, as was just referenced, the private sector will take care of a lot of those supply issues by themselves. We do need to provide some incentives for those things to happen, maybe a lot quicker than they're happening now. But how do we change your directive as it relates to the affordability issue? And so I just find that with some of your responses today, we were missing that word affordability. With some of the programs, we've seen some critiques, some constructive criticism of some of the programs in the past in terms of building into those programs an element of affordability. And so how does that narrative, how does it change? Is it a directive that you need from the government to say, we need to do more from an affordability perspective to it's beyond that 80% of AMR, it's something much lower than that. And so how does that happen? Help me with that, please.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, and I apologize if I haven't used affordability enough, because it's absolutely crucial. While supply overall is important at all levels, that we can't lose our focus on affordability. And each of our programs plays at a different, I would say, along the housing continuum. Some, as you say, are more supply driven. And in fact, before the rental construction financing initiative, it's had an impact on increase of purpose-built rental. So it's not only how much housing or the affordability, but the type of housing as well. So purpose-built rental has a really important role to play, and not just building single-family homes or condominiums. So we operate within our authorities, and when it comes to the depth of affordability, ultimately that's dependent on the amount of contributions that can be put into a program like the Rapid Housing Initiative. It's the contributions that help housing providers provide affordable rents, because it minimizes the equity that they have to put into the program. So I would say that's would be the biggest thing, other than just changing the definition or the requirement around affordability. It can be around the amount of contributions that we're putting into these programs.
Mr. Chair, that's the only question I have. I'm going to cede the rest of my time to my friend Michael.
Thanks. 2 minutes, Mr. Chair. Great. Thanks, Mr. Collins.
I'll start by sharing that my frustration being here today is based on the number of people experiencing homelessness in my community, having tripled in the last 3 years to over 1,000 people. And while that's not the sole, it's not solely CMHC's fault that that's the case, I have several local nonprofit housing providers in my community who are telling me that CMHC is the single largest challenge for them getting more units built. And they're letting me know that funding is not being provided at agreed upon levels, that loan insurance for mortgages is 3 times as long as industry standards, and that the process to engage is far too long and expensive. And so your website, and we've heard today, says that this is the quote: "We are driven by one goal: housing affordability for all." And that, for me and my community, is not the experience that nonprofit providers are experiencing. I'm very disappointed that your answer to Mr. Collins with respect to real estate investment trusts was not simply $0. Real estate investment trusts, the fact that they're receiving funds ahead of nonprofit builders. And so if I get 2 questions. The first, why is any real estate investment trust receiving any money from CMHC ahead of a nonprofit provider? In 10 seconds or 15.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Real estate investment trusts are not receiving funding in our National Housing Strategy programs at all, let alone ahead of not-for-profits.
Okay, great. I think the answer to Mr. Collins earlier seemed to suggest differently. My last question is simply, could I receive all documents that the committee is receiving, Mr. Chair? Is that possible?
Yeah, I'm sure members would share their documents with them, but they come to the committee. Ultimately, they're public, so as the chair, I don't have a problem. It's the committee's prerogative, but I'm sure we can accommodate you, Mr. Maurice.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
You got a short question. That's it? Okay.
I got one more. One last one then. My question, the question earlier to Mr. Collins, why did CMHC decide to reduce the RHI amount per door? Why was that decision made?
Thank you for the question. Again, with rapid housing, we're trying to achieve as many units as possible through the program, and we allocated the money based on the total number of units that we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Mr. Maurice. Mr. Collins, Mr. Aitchison, I've now had to cut it 2.5 minutes. Each will get.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Another 2.5 minutes. So I have a very specific question now about, again, the process, which is obviously more your department. So I've anecdotally heard examples of groups or organizations that have gotten through the painful process, got the funding agreement, and it was a loan and whatever it might be. But then, of course, this year has been a difficult year for interest rates, of course, they got the approval at the beginning of the year, and by the time they were able to get shovels in the ground, everything ready and going and everything, and money started to flow, the interest rate changed because the CMHC committed the funds, but the interest rate was not committed at the time of commitment. The interest rate was at time of the beginning of the flowing of funds. It was enough of a change. The project didn't make sense anymore. So it's a very specific example, but have you addressed that situation? I mean, I assume the CMHC has some capacity to play with interest rates a little bit more than a bank might.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the way that our lending works is we do crown borrowing. We borrow from the government and then lend to our clients. So we don't fix those interest rates. We borrow the funds, and there have been circumstances where we've borrowed those funds in advance in order to fix those interest rates, but that does carry some risk both for CMHC and the proponent if the deal doesn't happen. So again, we've been in an unprecedented.
I'm sorry to just say, Paul, but does it though? Like I wonder, like if that project doesn't happen, there's got to be 10 more in the queue waiting. So why would I mean? It's not like you're going to be left holding money borrowed that you can't loan. I got to think.
So I'm going to defer to Mr. LaHood on this question as he deals with this on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. I would say that between 2020 and early 2022, we had a lot of cases where rates had gone up and made a lot of the projects unviable. We actually stepped up and provided more funding in terms of contributions to make those projects work. That being said, we only fix the rate when we advance funds because we're providing a 10-year loan, and so as soon as construction start is when we fix the rates and start dispersing funds. If we fix it any time before, there is a risk that the project doesn't go through and that the nonprofit is now borrowing funds that they can't pay back. So we actually wait until that happens.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm out of time, but I will just say as a quick, whoever does your polling and your analysis of your satisfaction, I'd like to use them myself in my own career.
Aitchison, Mr. Collins for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. You know, I for a lot of affordable housing providers, and I'm now wearing my old hat as president of City Housing Hamilton, our main two issues that we had as a priority were fixing old units, many of them 50, 60 years old, and building new to get people off the affordable housing wait list. And so what I've found about in dealing with the programs here is that the per door costs that you're investing in many of the program areas are very high. Rapid Housing is an example of that. It's a great program because you give tremendous amount of, you had provided tremendous amount of grant money, but the unit costs are about $600,000, and so your return, our collective return on our investment, is very expensive. In that, if I use that as an example, Toronto City Housing has hundreds of vacant units that are in the 50 to 60-year-old category. They're uninhabitable, and so they sit, and they've sat for years, many of them. Hamilton has the same inventory. I'm sure all my colleagues around the table have an inventory like that, and the cost to get people living in those units again is probably in the 100, 150, 200. You know, you're talking about leaky foundations. Every time it rains, the basement fills up, and so you kind of need, you know, an overhaul of the unit from a basement perspective, if I use that as an example. And so your return on your investment in terms of getting people off the wait list and into these houses is at a much lower cost point than what we're collectively paying for rapid housing units. And so do you ever take those things into consideration? I know those units would be eligible for co-investment fund, but if you were to provide a grant to municipalities and not-for-profits, and there are probably thousands of these units across the country, those units could be fixed within 6 months, where we avoid the 2-year application process. We avoid the whole issue of trying to find a lender and a percentage point on borrowing that works for everyone. You essentially just find, if you can find people in the construction industry to do that work, those units come almost immediately. And so I would just ask that as you review your policies every 3 years, as you said you would, if you could think about that on a per unit basis, you would do more in funding those projects than any other stream that you have provided since the development of the National Housing Strategy. So I leave that with you.
So thank you for that question. In fact, we did recently make offers to a number of municipalities through the co-investment contribution, specifically for that purpose. As you are aware, the rapid housing is specifically for the development of new units, but through the co-investment, we've worked on some offers to municipalities, which have been very popular take up to do exactly that and fix some of those units that are under their management.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Madame Chabot pour 2 minutes et demie.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. I would perhaps have one question that would aim at the fact that perhaps we could get more offered. I think that there's been a recent law that came into effect in January 1st, 2023 for bans on sales of Canadian properties, residential properties, to foreigners. So in my writing, we've taken a look at that, and I think the committee could look at this issue too for non-Canadians who it's trying to avoid speculation, of course. For permanent residents who are not necessarily speculators, do you think we might modify the legislation to so that not everyone gets caught up as being classified as a speculator? We have permanent residents who are unhoused or perhaps renters, tenants. Is there any perspective on this? I think you were involved in probably recommending or being consulted when this law came into effect or before.
Question, Monsieur le Président.
Thanks for the question, Chair.
With regards to the foreign buyer ban, I believe there are exceptions in the rule in the legislation for permanent residents of Canada.
Vous croyez?
Is that verifiable fact, or you believe? I'd like to get that in writing if we could. Thank you. Further question? We've had some interesting times in this committee when we were talking about the rapid housing. There's a number of recommendations, I think, to be made by that the money be available much more quickly, that it could be perhaps transferred to another program, that you have the sufficient data to ensure follow-ups, and that the fund be dedicated also for the renovation of certain housing units. Are you going to give serious consideration to the recommendations in this report, or how do you think that you'll follow up? Will the HCMC use to clarify the objectives of this new fund?
To respond to that, Mr. Mason, in writing to the committee to her request, Ms. Kwan for 2.5 minutes to end this part.
Following up on my last question on the RCFI, where the response was to say that the program is oversubscribed, is that under the new program?
So the requirements under the rental construction financing initiative have not yet changed.
So your reference was on the previous program, notwithstanding under that program the rent was actually quite not affordable, somewhere between 30 to 120% above market. So the new program that was part of the agreement with the NDP has not yet been launched. So thank you for that. Good to know. On the issue around funding that CMHC received for Indigenous women and girls, and this is in particular the $420 million that was allocated to build transitional shelters, transitional homes and shelters for Indigenous women and girls. Why hasn't any of those dollars flowed?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, and I'll ask my colleague Ben Williams to add on to this. But what I can tell you is we've committed approximately $90 million for 22 projects to date in that stream, and I'd ask my colleague to comment further.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, in 2021 there was $420 million announced for the shelter initiative. We had 2 windows for applications in 2022. And as my colleague, Mr. Mason, just said, 22 projects have been selected for approximately $80 to $90 million. As with our other programs, funding flows with construction. And so, although committed, now we're waiting for some of the documents to come in to be able to start flowing those advances, and we expect that in the coming months.
Yeah, I just want to point out as each year passes, as the money don't get to the ground to build the housing, people are dying. So I'm just saying that on the record. And it keeps on coming back to say, oh, you know, they haven't actually come and launched. It's the process within CMHC that's not moving it forward. That's why the programs are not launched. If you talk to the nonprofits on the ground, they say, we're ready, but we're still waiting for CMHC for approval so we can get the money and get the projects off the ground. So I can't emphasize that enough, how frustrating it is continually. I want to ask this question.
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. Your time has exhausted. That concludes this portion of the committee's study. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing this morning from CMHC. You can see it is a subject matter that is a top priority amongst all members of this committee. And we thank you for the informative session we had. We'll suspend for a moment while we move in camera to do drafting instructions as it reports. Ms. Kwan, do you have a point of order?
Yeah, I just want to express my thanks to the officials. I think this round of questioning from officials was more forthcoming than any other rounds that we've had with both the minister and with the head of CMHC. So I just want to say thank you and my appreciation to staff that appeared today.
Well, thank you. With that, we will suspend for a moment.